Thanks,
You're
Natan.
ready.
Presentation. Um, all right, I think we should be ready to go. Thanks, everybody. Any housekeeping before we get started? No. All right. Yeah, I see Mama Swati, if I'm saying your name correctly, welcome. Folks that are coming here for the first time, feel free to introduce yourselves in chat. Natan, please, you have the floor. Thanks for putting this together. I'm very eager to hear.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for having me. Has been a while since I last presented on a Tuesday morning, so it's something that I really was excited to do. And today I'm going to talk about intersectional analysis, how to evaluate and intervene on inequalities. So this is going to be a brief presentation, more like a webinar, because when we talk about intersectional analysis, it takes a lot of effort to really grasp what it can do, both qualitative and quantitative analysis. So I'm just gonna put some concepts that I've been studying for my PhD. So my name is Natan Nascimento. I am a psychiatric and mental health nurse practitioner. I have a master in nursing and I am a PhD candidate also in nursing. My pronouns are they, them, but feel free to call me whenever it's easier. So if you cannot say Natan, you can always call me Nathan, Nate. It's fine either way. So the first thing we need to understand when we talk about intersectional analysis is what is intersectionality? So we need to understand intersectionality as the multiple parts that makes ourselves as a whole. So when we talk about the multiple parts of our identity that really cannot be parted. So you need to think this as a recipe for a cake. So whenever you're doing a cake, or whenever you're baking a cake, you put a lot of ingredients together to make sure it's the right flavor, to make sure it grows right, to make sure it's baked right. You put a right amount of heat, you put a right amount of eggs, milk, uh, flour, everything in there needs to be this exact amount of what you want it to be. And when we talk about intersectionality, we need to understand that the different ingredients like eggs, flour, oil, all of these can be used to create another recipes. Like egg can be on pasta, it can be on bread, it can be on cake, it can be on uh, egg itself. What makes it unique? It's the mixture. Everything you mix together makes it unique. You can even do like different types of cake. You can do carrot cake, you can do chocolate cake, vanilla cake, strawberry cake. Anything it's possible whenever you mix the right ingredients. So, and once you bake it, once you mix everything, you cannot take that back. It won't go back to its original state. So once you add the eggs on the flour, you cannot take the eggs back and become egg again. It will be now a dough. So intersectionality talks about all these components, all these ingredients that makes you you. And it's not something that can be uh, partitioned. It needs to be as a whole. So when we're talking about intersectionality, it needs to be understood as part of our identity, but not the same as identity. I'll talk about more of that later on this presentation, but this is a brief explanation on how you cannot take back the flour once you add it to a cake. It won't become flour again, it will be cake. And those parts, those ingredients are just like our race, our gender, our sexuality, our socioeconomic status. They makes ourselves. They make ourselves who we are. So this is important when we're talking about how we can really create a method to analyze intersectionality. So once you create this, there's no turning back. So we need to create this image on our head that is not separable. Race, gender, sexuality, they're not separate. That's what makes us unique. So intersectionality was first named by Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a legal professor at UCLA, as far as I know, and is a metaphor for understanding ways that multiple forms of inequalities or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves to create obstacles that often are not uh, understood among conventional ways of thinking. So when we're talking about intersectionality, we need to understand really that it's not to create who we are, but to understand how those different identities of ourselves are compounding themselves on top of each other to make who we are. So as I was saying prior to this, race and gender are two separate characteristics, but a Black woman is always a Black woman. She's not like sometimes a woman, sometimes Black. She's always a Black woman. So it's not something that can be separated. It needs to be understood as a whole concept. And this is important because when we're talking about uh, research and analysis in a myriad of ways, this understanding makes it easier for us to really see who is actually the risk groups, the most vulnerable groups. So think about how uh, sexual violence or sexual assault is something very common for women, more common in women than it is on men. And women will probably feel more fear of being sexually assaulted than men would. And this is something that we can prove statistically. But once yet another thing to that layer that is being sexually assaulted by uh, law enforcement personnel, like policemen or prosecutors or anything like that, something that in our concept, in our imaginary, is something that we cannot grasp, like how a policeman would do that to me. When we try to analyze this concept, it will be more equal. It won't have a significant difference between the fear among men and among women because we expect them not sexually assault me. But this is not true for all women, and this is not true for all men. So if we try to locate inside the women, the Black women, the women of color, those groups will probably have a significant fear of being sexually assaulted by policemen. And that is something that needs to be evaluated. Because when we're talking about intersectionality, we're talking about inequalities and disadvantage that compound themselves and cannot be separated. There are one thing, Black women are always Black and always women. It's not like, okay, I'm going to consider her Black now, and now I'm going to consider her women. That's not something that we can do. So this was first named intersectionality in 1989 by Crenshaw, but the idea has been here for a couple of time now. So I brought here in Brazilian philosophist, not sure which word to use here, a feminist. She's named Lélia Gonzalez, and she created this idea prior. So in 1979, she already said that there is a unmistakable political backwardness in Brazilian feminist movements as they are led by middle-class white women. Here too, one can see the need to disavow racism. Here too, one can see the need to hide from the scene the crucial issue. The liberation of white women has been done at the expense of the exploitation of Black women. So the idea of intersectionality is not new. It actually goes back to the 19th century. So and it has always been part of Black feminism. So to really understand intersectionality, you need to understand Black feminism and how race was a critical point, understanding point, a turning point in understanding legal rights for women. Because on segregation, they said, okay, so women has power to vote, but did Black people had? Did Black women had the same privileges that men had, and not just like white men, but Black men as well? So when we're talking about intersectionality, is this whole idea, this whole concept of, okay, someone is always a Black man, someone is always a Black woman. Black is one of many characteristics. We can access race separate. Yeah, we can try to do that. But when we're trying to really grasp the understanding of risk factors or casualties on research, on any type of um, perception, like alcohol use, we really need to understand that it's not because someone is a man that will have this behavior. So we need to really understand that Black man has different behaviors than white man, and Black man, Black gay man will behave differently from Black cisgender heterosexual man. So this is something that needs to be addressed to fully understand what the data is telling us and how to really understand the risk factors that we have on health. So picture this as a intersection at a road. We're talking about different ways that we can understand these relations of power. So sexism, racism, ageism, xenophobia, elitism, ableism, transphobia, homophobia, everything is a way and they're all together. So those intersections, they can be in a multitude of paths. So we can have sexism, racism, elitism, ableism, transphobia, and homophobia in the same intersection, depending on the person. So myself, I am a non-binary person who's also a Latin white person, who's also a disabled person. I have a disability. So in that perception, I am in a cross-section, an intersection of transphobia, ableism, xenophobia, sexism, and homophobia. Of course, that if we can start to analyze each individual, we'll see more and more of those prejudices or more of those violences that we have among marginalized groups. So in that concept, intersectionality helps us to understand where we're at. And it comes from the individual level to the social level. So it's not who we are, but how society defines who we are and acts on that. It needs to be based on relations of power. So we're not talking about here identity. We're talking about relations of power. So you see in this picture that is not transgender, it's transphobia. Is the prejudice against transgender people because transgender are fine, but transphobia is not. And that creates a whole intersection of, okay, so I am, as a transgender person, not able to access some type of health services. I'm not able to access care. I'm not able to access the pharmacy. That is intersectionality. We're talking about relations of power. So no power, no intersectionality. This is something really important. So now I'm gonna go and do a little pause here and ask if anyone has any doubts on that. I know it's a lot to process because it's a concept that really needs to be understood to perform a intersectional analysis. But let me know if you have any questions that I can address about intersectionality prior to how we can perform the analysis itself.
I don't see any questions or comments, Natan. I think we can move forward.
Okay.
While it's a different concept to grasp, I think it's also a concept that has been discussed, has been taken up on discussion. So, and especially on this group, I think this
Yeah.
group captures the concept.
Okay, perfect. So I always like to do this pause to make sure we all understand what this means, because when we're talking about intersectionality, sometimes there needs to be there's some misconceptions about it. So I just really need to I just want to make sure that everyone understand what the prior concept is. So on that, I have three recommendations for you to understand more if you want. It's called Critical Race Theory, Intersectionality, and for those who speak Portuguese, Por Feminismo Afro-Latino-Americano. Those three books create a really well concept of intersectionality. So the first one is a collaboration among those that really have an understanding of intersectionality and race and how that shapes the world. The second one, Patricia Hill Collins, she was the first to really organize the method of intersectionality. And the third one is to understand how different cultures understand this process of intersectionality. So one of the things when we're talking about analysis, data analysis on intersectionality is to understand its multidimensionality and how it can be measured. So the concept of intersectionality is a framework, not a theory. So we don't have something that will be like, okay, so this is a theory that compounds. No, it's more like a framework that helps us understand more complex theories. And when we're talking about intersectionality, we first need to understand the multidimensionality of data and if we're measuring what we really think we're measuring. So measurement depends on intention. It can be blurred by the views of the researcher. So when we're talking about gender, it was something that I really had when I first started to read in English, especially papers, articles in English. I would sometimes see confusion with regards of sex and gender by American and English speakers researchers, because usually you understand that gender and sex are interchangeables, so they can be synonyms, which they're not. And now we have more understanding of that, and the journals are now more frequently being asked or asking to researchers to specify if it's gender, if it's sex, if it's any other type of characteristic regarding this characteristic. And there seems to be sometimes a poor understanding by some researchers of what that really means. So a cisgender heterosexual researchers sometimes will see a question as, are you female and male? And think that, okay, now I have a data that I can use as sex. But are you really, or are you using a proxy measure? Because do you really want to ask if you are male or female, or you want to ask if the person has XY chromosomes, or if the person is perceived as a man by the community, if the person produces high levels of testosterone, or if the person have always lived as a boy or a man? So when we're trying to collect data, sometimes we just say, okay, let's put some text and then put some gender. But are these aligned on what we really want to measure? So if you're talking about um, biological factors, sometimes we need to know if the person has XY chromosomes, because some characteristics are related to the Y chromosome, and that, of course, people who has X chromosomes won't have it, won't inherit it. But if we're talking about like alcohol use, ask if it's male or female may not be the best approach, because we don't need to know if the person has X, Y chromosomes. Sometimes we need to see if the person sees themselves as a man or a woman, or if the person is perceived by their community as a man or a woman. Because of course, if we're trying to talk about how the genetic factors of alcohol use is related to gender, then of course we can ask if it's female or male, because now we have justification to that. That makes sense. But if you're talking about alcohol use, by alcohol use with no genetic compounds whatsoever, then it doesn't make sense to ask if it's male or female, because that won't make any difference. What we really need to know is, do you really need to know sex or gender, or even perception of gender, or even testosterone levels? And it's okay to use proxy measures. It's not something that it cannot be used. Proxy measures are fine and are great, but they need to be seen and understand as proxy. So we cannot put gender if we're asking male or female. That's not gender. That's sex. That's biological sex. And it's not the only, well, the only two biological sexes. If we're talking about genetics, XY chromosomes, XX chromosomes, we also have XXY, we have X0, we have a lot of different ones. So are we measuring what we really need to measure? This is the first question. So we need to understand what we're measuring and this multidimensionality of data, because it makes a difference when we're talking about intersectional analysis. And how can this really create a whole new perception of risk that is not really true? So this goes for those that are engaged in psychometrics, new ways to measure things, especially those psychometric characteristics or components, needs to be really well known and created in new ways to be sure that we're measuring what we really need to measure. And then we go to intersectionality and identity synonyms. Short answer, no. Long answer, also no. But because some characteristics are not part of our identity. So do you need to identify yourself as poor to be affected by poverty? And yet we use poverty as a measure all the time in intersectional analysis. So intersectionality and identity are not synonyms. We cannot, or we don't need to use only identity traits in an intersectional analysis. We need to understand the wholeness of characteristics of a person. So poverty is something that affects me, even though I don't identify myself as poor. Not that I'm not poor, but it's not part of my identity. It's more like a state. It's more like a social perception based on how much wealth do I have. I'd have. So intersectionality and identity are not the same thing and cannot be treated as the same thing. Of course, we need to understand what identity is in order to make sure we are really doing intersectional analysis, but they're not the same thing. Also, can we apply intersectional analysis to any research? Short answer, no. Long answer, also no. Intersectional approach needs a great understanding of identity, meta-perception, health processes, and social power dynamics. So we need to understand what identity is. We need to understand how others perceive my identity. We need to understand how processes in health can create outcomes that are sometimes not expected, and how there is different dynamics of power in our society and how that changes in cultural and geographic disparities. So no, intersectionality is not something that can be applied to any research. It doesn't mean we cannot do it. It just means that some researchers are okay not being intersectional. If you want to do intersectional analysis, it needs to be uh, a thinking process from the scratch. So it needs to start at the beginning of that research. Sometimes you won't be able to do intersectional analysis using secondary data because it won't have the data you need. Sometimes it will, and it's good, but sometimes it won't. That's why it's so important how we measure things. Because if we have a good understanding of measurements, then it will make sense that any type of data set following the fairness guides, it will have a part of being intersectional analysis by its core. So we need to make sure that measurements and multidimensionality are well-known concepts prior to a intersectionality analysis. Also, we can do, now I'm going to go to a more practical part of the talk. That is how we can perform qualitative and quantitative analysis, intersectional analysis. So we can do both. It's not a problem. And we can do mixed methods as well. We just need to make sure that we using the correct designs and the correct analysis for each of the research. So for qualitative, it needs to be completely focused on the intersectional group. So it's not a problem with qualitative analysis. It's part of its method. It's part of itself. That is the small sample. We won't have like 1,000 interviews. That's not something doable for a qualitative, because we work in a conception of saturation. We work in a conception of, okay, so now I won't need any more people to be enrolled in this research because I already have all the concepts that I needed. And that is fine because it's part of the method. But with that, we sometimes do not or cannot create clusters in qualitative analysis when we do intersectional approach. So if we want to compare different lived experiences among like white women and Black women, we will need a bigger sample size. Otherwise, we will need to focus solely on the intersectional group. So Black women that have sex with women. That is intersectional group, and my research will focus on that. So that is a qualitative approach. The quantitative still needs some development because it's something new. So as intersectionality was created and nominated in a qualitative aspect of the person, because we're talking about individuals, and quantitative usually talks about generalization. So we're talking about general groups and how to assess risks for a multitude of peoples and groups. It's still pretty new on how to really access those intersectionalities in quantitative analysis. But it has descriptive now, after like a decade or so on intersectional approaches. It has now descriptives and analytical ways to perform, even with small samples. And when I'm talking about small samples, I'm not talking about 100. I'm talking about 1,000 to 5,000, depending on the number of iterations that we're doing in the approach. So I'm going to talk about qualitative research first. And the first thing is how to decide which design we can use to perform a qualitative research with intersectionality approach. So usually we have two designs that are best for this type of approach, for this type of analysis, that is ethnography and social representation. And why ethnography focuses on lived experiences of groups and how different aspects of those lived experiences are shaped by different aspects. So the ethnography, it's created to understand the lived experiences of different groups. And this is basically what intersectionality means. So ethnography is probably the best qualitative research that we can have to perform an intersectional analysis. We also have social representation because it focuses on perception, identity, and meta-perception of symbols. So when we're talking about social representation, I'm talking about those researches that are based on uh, usually Moscovici or Desjolins theories of psychological social psychology, actually, and how it perceives those symbols to be part of our identity and part of our social identity. So social representation may be a good approach to intersectional analysis. But we have this thing with sample size that is sometimes if you're comparing groups, the sample might need to be bigger than expected. So the saturation won't come with 16, 20, sometimes it will come with 70. And it's something that we need to be aware when we do intersectional approach, because sometimes it won't be doable. Some groups are not that big in our geographic area to make us really able to interview and intervene with them. So if we want a really specific type of lived experience or intersectionality, we might need to not compare them to anything, just to really perform this analysis, trying to understand these experiences and these understandings, not just comparisons that we have been seeing more and more in qualitative analysis. So this is a actually brand new paper that was on International Journal for Equity and Health. It's from last week, and it's called There's Just a Mismatch, a qualitative exploration of health systems and organization level barriers to accessing cancer services among people experiencing structural marginalization. So this is an ethnography with multi-groups, but not trying to compare those groups, just trying to understand, using different groups to understand how being marginalized shapes the access to cancer services. This is a great example of how to perform an intersectional analysis in qualitative research. So if you're interested on that, we can also talk more about that later. But it's something that you can read and see how they perform it, and really creating just categories that make sense for all of those groups that are studying. So this is an example that I brought, and I'm not the most uh, proficient qualitative researcher, although I like to think myself as a methodologist and a mixed methods researcher. I do have more experience and I do like more numbers. So I have a bigger part of this presentation focused on quantitative analysis, but feel free to ask me any questions about qualitative research on intersectional approach is something that I really am engaging right now. So for quantitative research, we're going to follow the same path. So how to decide which design to use. And here I brought Greta Bauer because she's probably the biggest reference we have right now in intersectional approach and quantitative research. She's Canadian and she has a lot of papers talking about intersectional approach and quantitative research. And she sees two ways to perform this: descriptive and analytical. Descriptive are more focused on quantifying inequalities. So we really need to understand, okay, so I have this inequality, I have that inequality, and I have that inequality. It's more focused on that. And we also have analytical, which are more focused on causation modeling. So we're trying to understand the causes of inequality, not just how many inequalities we have. Because again, we're talking about intersectionality, we're talking about inequalities or disabilities that are together to create bigger gaps in access healthcare or in be able to go to school, be able to have food. So all of those things that makes us us. So those inequalities, when we're trying to quantify them, a descriptive analysis is fine. But when trying to understand the causation of the inequalities, then analytical approach is more doable. And this talk is based on this paper. So it's Greta Bauer and Aideen Shane. I think that's how you pronounce this name. Um, and it was published in 2019, Methods for Analytical Intercategorical Intersectionality and Quantitative Research, Discrimination as the Mediator of Health Inequalities. And it's a great paper that really shows step-by-step how to perform analytical and descriptive analysis for intersectionality. So this is a paper that I really, really suggest for anyone that is doing any type of intersectional analysis to read this and have this anytime at hand where you're starting to think a research and a research process. So this is a descriptive example. For descriptive, we can use multiple analysis. So we can do hypothesis test, it's fine. We can do cross classification, it's also probably the best one. Regression with interactions, this is great when we're trying to understand not just how different identity traits like race and gender adds up, but how they shape together the effects of a disease or a health process. We can also use machine learning components like random forest models. We have many others, but those four are probably the best ones that we have right now. So this is part of the article, this figure here, and it's just doing a descriptive analysis. So we have a median for Kessler score, and it's based on race and sexual or gender minority. Joan, we want to...
Yeah, I just want to clarify, what is cross classification? What group of methods are they pulling under cross classification?
Class classification is this process of assigning two categories as one. So in this table
Like
here, we have...
building subgroups.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So they put class classification as putting subgroups. So white non-sexual gender minority, white sexual gender minority, Asian non. So this cross classification, it can be built with as many subgroups as possible, focusing, of course, in the sample size. But in this specific analysis, descriptive analysis, it's based basically on understanding how you can see differences, like more sensible differences, just by looking at it. So looking at this graph, we can see that there is differences on how discrimination impacts on psychological organization and depression, just by looking at these graphs. So we can see that white non-sexual gender minority as the primary factor or as the reference group, meaning that it's the group that experienced less discrimination, will have less depression symptoms or any psychological symptoms than Middle Eastern sexual and gender minority groups. And this is seen in the graph, and you can see in the table here when they do the statistical analysis. So Middle Eastern sexual and gender minorities as such, gay, lesbian, transgender, Middle Eastern, they have experienced more psychological effects than most of the other groups, except for indigenous sexual gender minorities. So this is an example of cross-classification and hypothesis test that can be used to do an intersectional approach. This is very simple to do. It's not something that needs to be really time-consuming, but it needs to be well thought. So it needs to make sure that we're doing everything that it's needed to not use confounders as intersectional traits. And of course, we have possibilities of regressions of interactions. So we can use both linear regressions or generalized linear models with interactions with both continuous or categorical outcomes. And the important part is to make sure that these interactions are accounted for and not adding like, okay, I did gender and race separately, and now I'm going to add the effects to create a intersectional. No, they need to be really interacting. So, and that is easy if you're familiar with R language, is you put an asterisk on the code, and usually it's how you do interactions in regression, and that is enough. But you need to make sure that you're using all the interactions needed. And for that, we need a large sample. And you can also use random forest models as the best intersectional machine learning approach. It performs better than car models, for example, because it really goes creating trees of decision and making sure that we are accounting for different types of traits in the intersectional approach. But of course, the best one, and the one that we as intersectional researchers are pushing more people to do, is the analytical one. And this is performed using moderation and mediation approach. So this here is based on the paper that I showed earlier. And it's talking about health outcome. And this health outcome is psychological distress mediated by discrimination and started by cross-stratified intersectional categories. For those that are not familiar, these gray arrows here represent the heterogeneity possibility of the values here. But this analytical way of doing DAG cycles, it's really useful to understand causation, and intersectional approach and quantitative research needs to go more towards that, because then we will be able to really understand if discrimination and intersectionality in this example are really related, and how this is related to a health outcome. So I'm going to go and put this here. So imagine A as interactions between race and sexual and gender minority groups. So we have the same groups as before. So white, non-sexual and gender minority, white, sexual and gender minority, all the way to Middle Eastern sexual and gender minorities. And we have the perceived discrimination that they refer. So they're saying, okay, so I have this much discrimination, I have this much discrimination. And the health outcome here, so Y is psychological distress. And what this intersectional analysis is showing us is when we put those that are moderated the less by discrimination, meaning those that suffer less with discrimination, being the white non-sexual and gender minorities, so white heterosexual cisgender people, when they are the references, and we put this mediation in this group, all the others have some type of difference, but only 3 have significant poor direct effect, meaning that Black non-sexual gender minorities will feel less discriminated than white non-sexual gender minorities when we account for moderation of discrimination. At the same way that Indigenous and Middle Eastern sexual and gender minorities feel more, they have more discrimination coming. So The pure direct effect here talks about how the intersectional categories go straight to the health outcome. So this is the direct effect. So being indigenous and sexual and gender minorities, if we take this excess of discrimination, they will still have poor outcomes. So they will be more anxious, they will be more depressed just because they're indigenous, sexual and gender minority. If we compare all of them, creating this discrimination baseline on white non-sexual gender minorities, they will have they have increased psychological distress. The same goes for Middle Eastern sexual and gender minorities. When we're talking about pure indirect effect, that meaning the mediation path going along with discrimination, all the groups fear more discrimination, of course. So those white sexual and gender minorities will have more health impacts when they have a discrimination increased. The same goes for Asian sexual and gender minorities, Black non-sexual and gender minorities, Black sexual and gender minorities, and all the groups. And last but not least, the mediated interaction that accounts for the hetero homogeneity of the sample is not significant, meaning that they all perceive discrimination as the same. So to close here, what we need at minimum to have an intersectional quantitative analysis. Focus on categories that represent intersection of axes of social power. No power, no intersection. So we need to make sure that we're using power, not just identity traits. So things that shape really the social perception of me and how that can lead me to not access some kind of service. Statistical methods that allow each intersection to have its own outcome level. So it's not adding up. Like, okay, I did gender and I did race and now I'm going to add up. No, gender and race need to be together, creating its own outcome level. Statistical methods that allow processes that generate outcomes to unfold differently across different intersections. So intersections can also have space for outcomes that are not foreseen in the beginning of the research, because sometimes we will appear something that is totally different than expected. And of course, we need to have an intersectional interpretation. So it's not just doing that. It's also doing really well reading of these results and seeing if that makes sense with the literature. And if it's not, why not? So this is at minimum what we need to understand and we need to have for intersectional quantitative analysis. So this is I try to rush a little bit to make sure that I cover all the points. This is all that I have for you today. I hope it was useful. And of course, you can reach directly to me with any questions or any ideas that you may have regarding intersectional analysis. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Natan, very much. This is a great overview. I think it's a great overview of the topic and then of the challenges of analyzing this. As you're going through, it was very obvious to me that the whole idea of adjusting for confounding in any kind of observational analysis has in its core the fact that confounding is very intersectional, and we
Yes.
never really address that in a good way. Now, if you bring that confounding to the core of the research, I think these methods you propose are very relevant. I'm going to open with a question and then see if folks have other comments. I'm curious that the latent class piece was not included.
Yes.
What is your thought? Do they discuss that in the paper, in the quantitative paper?
Yes and no, they did not include that because the latent class, it's another way that we can do intersection analysis, but it's more based on how to really address psychometric traits. And this is more based on, okay, so I have this data set and I really cannot do multiple ways to measure things. How can I do this without having to account for every single psychometric value? So it's more related to how can I use what I have instead of trying to create new things. Of course, that the latent class analysis is something that it's really important for intersection analysis. But when we're talking about intersectionality in its core, it's more useful to understand how these inequalities are shaped rather than the inequality itself. And so the latent class analysis will go more to a descriptive way than an analytical way, in their point of view, of course. And it's not something that it cannot be used. It's just something that will have a causation added to that. So that's why they didn't use it. It's not, but it's really useful and it's something that needs to be more studied in intersectional analysis. So yeah, it's something that needs to be, it can be used and needs to be more used.
Yeah, a quick follow-up to that, and then Catherine has a comment. I want to invite you to think about latent class not necessarily as an analysis of psychometric outcomes, but in
Yes,
the concept of if you do have an outcome you're studying and you pass that through some sort of unsupervised learning, phenotyping, or whatever, that includes the outcome as part of the traits to find the similarities. This might be a way to address this confounding aspect that talks more about intersectionality than adjusting for confounding in a
yes,
very complex model with multiple layers.
yes. It's just yeah, I think it's something important to think about. I just need to really need to address is confounding intersectionality is really difficult because sometimes what we think it's confounding is actual intersectionality, and sometimes what we think is intersectionality is actually a confounder. So we need to really, really pay attention to what literature says, and if we have a literature overview of that characteristic as a confounding or not in any ways, because sometimes we say, okay, so race is a confounder here because race is not a confounder, race is intersectional part of the person. So it's something that's one of the problems with intersectional analysis and how it cannot be addressed in any research. But yeah, it's something that needs to be seen as latent class. How can we address these confounders as confounders and not something that it's treated as intersectional traits?
That's Catherine.
So amazing, Natan. If you could go back to the slide that you had of um, comparing, yeah, this is perfect. So when I saw this, the biggest thing that I took away from this, not mathematically or analytically, was the challenge
Yes,
of thinking about this in the setting of all of the myriad of cultures that we work, right? And
yes,
so if I'm in North Carolina, that's a far different culture and environment and component and set of structural barriers and racism than
yes,
if I'm in Eastern North or East Africa and Tanzania, and more so
yes,
that if I'm in the Middle East. And so I don't even like it confounds my mind to even like try to pull all of these thoughts together in the different contexts because like
yes.
we can't. Um,
Yeah,
and and then on top of that, how do we start to think about these intersectional challenges given the amount of structural biases that are so inherent in some of the cultures where we work? So thinking about being, let's say, being Black in North Carolina, right? It's going to be very
yes.
different than in other environments, and how we take that, think about that and that impact on the populations.
Yeah, so that's something important. And I think that it's related to how we understand intersectionality itself. So when we're talking about like being Black in North Carolina, we also have to understand how it's different to be Black in Durham and how it's different to be Black in Charlotte. Because it is different. Not because being Black is different, but because being Black in that setting is different. So this is intersectionality. And that's the problem with intersectional analysis and quantitative research, because you need to account for everything almost, because each individual has its own, it's like an individual cake and have different ingredients. And sometimes you put just 1 milligram of flour will have a different outcome. And in that perception and in that way, we can do intersectional analysis across different cultures and across different geographical areas by accounting that as being like, okay, so I really need to understand what's the difference between being Black in North Carolina, being Black in New York, and being Black in France, and being Black in Brazil. There's 4 different things and 4 different approaches. And with that, we need to create these variables that is, okay, Black French, Black Brazilian, Black North Carolina, and that will allow us to create effects that will sometimes be useful to understand a little bit more of the real risk factors. It's not something that is going to be quantitative, it's more qualitative. It needs to be qualitative. And to make sure that it is quantitative, we will need like a big sample from each group to make sure that we are understanding this correctly. And they need to be as controlled as possible. But again, it's part of the method not being. So it needs to have also room for different traits. So it needs to be understood what's the reference in being Black. What I want to understand that's why measurements are important. That's why we need to make sure we're measuring what we really want to measure. So what's the real thing? What's the real goal here? So, okay, being Black, why is that a reference? And which reference is that? We also need to put the whites in there and the Asians and the indigenous, and then we end up with a myriad of identities and traits that need to be accounted for, and that's part of the method. So it's completely overwhelming sometimes.
Yes, it is. But that's what's so cool about it. It's just like this amazing,
Yes,
complex process that trying to put it out into numbers is just really cool. So very nicely presented.
thank you.
All right, we're gonna have to close because we're at the time. Thank you, Natan. You're very welcome to come bring more of this. If it would be great